Hey, I'm Hunter from Skillthrive, and in this video, we're going to be building this 404 page in HTML and CSS. Now, in a previous video, which I released earlier this week, we actually designed this page in Figma. So if you're interested in learning how to design landing pages like this one in Figma, be sure to check out the link in the description or be subscribed so you're notified when I release similar videos in the future. So with that said, let's go ahead and jump in and get started on the code. So here I have a GitHub starter project, which allows you to just duplicate it, and then we can have a common starting place for our project. And it also uses Parcel, which is a bundler, which just makes it a lot easier if you're trying to actually, do this and move it to production as well. So with that said, now that we're in this GitHub repo, which I'll link in the description, come down to code and then under HTTPS, copy this value. Then on our terminal, I'm going to head to the section in our computer where I want to actually store this, which in our case is going to be in the documents, and then in a folder called record. Then I say git clone, paste in that value, and then I want to name the project. Now, if you didn't name this, it's going to just call the project Parcel Static Starter, but I'll go ahead and call this Noise 404 page. So we hit return. That is going to clone the project. If we hit ls, we can see that now. And if we go into it and then type code period, we can open that up in VS Code. So VS Code is opening up, and let's go ahead now and just move this over to the right. Now, once you actually have this up, the first thing we need to do is install the dependencies so all of our server and all that stuff works. So what we can do is say npm I for install, and then wait for that all to be installed. So once that's installed, what you can do is run npm run dev, and that's going to create a new local server for us. So if we go to localhost 1234, you'll now see the starter project here in our code base. If we refresh that, it was cached from the older value, but this is what the actual starter project will look like. All right, so now we have an idea of kind of getting everything ready to get started. Let's go ahead and jump into our main HTML file. So we'll come into source, down to this HTML. I'm going to then just get rid of this or minimize this and then go ahead and edit this just a little bit. So the first thing, let's go ahead and just change the title here to 404 page. Let's go ahead and get rid of this import because we don't need that anymore. And we also can just get rid of these basic styles. So let's go ahead and save that. Now everything over here in our browser looks like a default empty page. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is let's go ahead and import the fonts that we need from this project. And the way we can get that is to come into our project, and then we'll see here in this Figma file that we have all of these text styles, which we need to actually make sure are supported in our HTML. So we have a Fira Sans here, and we have extra bold, and we also have a light font, and I think that's everything that we'll need. So let's come into our browser again. I'll go to fonts.google.com. And I think we actually need, if we come back into this is a medium size, so we'll need to make sure that we get this one as well. So we'll need a 300, a 500, and an 800 font weight. So let's go ahead and search for Fira. So from here, what we can do is we can go ahead and add these styles to our selection. So we'll say this light 300. We also need the 500, and we need the 800 extra bold. So once we have those selected, we can come up to this icon to view our selected family. We can see the three weights we need, and then we can go ahead and click on this link, select it, copy it, and then we can paste it into our code. So I'm just going to make this, again, go off to our left so it's a little minimized. Then in the header, we can go ahead and paste that in. So now we'll be able to actually access this in our CSS because we're importing it from Google Fonts. Now let's go ahead and move on to the body tag. And in this tutorial, I'm going to be using Emmet to try to speed up some of the writing of this, which is a really good thing to get used to if you're writing HTML in VS Code. So by default, you could just write a div like this, which is probably good if you're just starting, just so you're used to the structure of how things work. But if you're, a little used to HTML, just kind of want to get a better idea of how things are, how to build pages like this, you can go ahead and use Emmet to do a shorthand version. Now, by default, Emmet is going to insert a div. So the way we can actually create a div with a class is just type a period and then the name of the class. And then we'll go ahead and hit enter, and that's going to create that div for us. So on this main wrapper, we also want to create a noise wrapper. So again, we'll create a div called noise wrapper. What's really cool about Emmet is you can actually nest these and tell it how to nest different things inside of this div. But just because if you're not familiar with Emmet, that can be a little complicated. So I'll just kind of have a nice brief intro here and go ahead and create that div. And then in here, we can go ahead and create another div called noise. So if we save that, that's everything we need for creating that noise layer, which is going to sit on top of this page. And below this, we'll create a new div called content wrapper. This is going to have an h1 tag that will have a class of title. And in here, we'll say 404. Then what we can do is below this, we can create a paragraph tag. And that's going to have a class of subtitle. Go ahead and write the paragraph. Now, remember from the design, if we save that, you can actually see this updated, but remember from the design that this channel is going to have a strike through in it. So what we can do is we can wrap this in a span tag, and that is going to allow us to target this channel directly, so we can style it as just having a strike through, and the rest of it will not be affected. Okay, so now we have that. The next thing we need to do is go ahead and create the link, or the anchor tag. Create an anchor tag here, and this is going to have a class of link. And the href is just going to be an empty href, so it's not actually linking to anything. And inside here, it's going to say go home. Now what we need to do here is we need to nest the SVG from our design. So again, if we come into Figma, you'll see here if we zoom in that there's this little chevron icon which is coming from hero icons. Now you could select this and export it as an SVG and then use that as an image, but what I like to do is just to copy the SVG, change the fill to current color, and then I can actually target that in my CSS to change the color of it. And what I do in order to copy this SVG from Figma, because it's not built in by default, is I use a plugin. So if you come into Figma, come over and select community and then search for SVG, you'll see that there is a plugin called SVG Export. Now I actually already have this installed, so I can come into the project, select the SVG, come up to plugins and then down to SVG Export, click on the icon and then copy this here, come back into the code, and then between this anchor tag, I can paste that here, and then you'll notice that you're not seeing it over here. You kind of do, it's this white because it's coming from this value right here. Now you could just use this and leave this as is, but what I like to do to make it a little more flexible to style in CSS is to change this to current color. So what will happen once we save this, if you just kind of take a guess? Well, what's going to happen is it's going to take the current color of its parent element, which is this anchor tag. So if we save this, you'll see now that it has this default color the same as the anchor tag, which we can then use to style the SVG separately in our CSS once we get to that part of the tutorial. So with that said, actually this is everything we need for our HTML. So let's go ahead and move on to the next part of the tutorial where we'll actually start writing the CSS. So let's jump up here to our Explorer and open this index.css file and then minimize this screen again. So we just go ahead and get rid of all of this default styles, but make sure you keep this normalized and sanitized CSS because that's going to give us a common starter place when we're, for all of the browsers that we might be developing for. So the first thing I like to do at the top of this CSS file is to define the CSS variables. It will define those on this root element, which in this case is the HTML tag from our HTML because this is the root element. And because we're targeting the root element, what this is going to allow us to do is to actually access those variables anywhere in this parent element. So anywhere in this, essentially, we can actually get access to those variables. Now, variables are just essentially just values that we store in CSS, which we can then use and reference in other parts of our CSS. And this is useful, for example, let's say a color changes, and instead of changing that color everywhere, we just change it in one spot where we actually defined it. Now, the way we actually create a variable is by first having 2 dashes, and then the name of the variable, and then the value of that variable. Now, this value is coming directly from Figma. So if I come into this Figma design, you'll see if I click off the canvas and come in under color styles, I have this gray 50. So I can click on that icon and then copy that hex code and then come back into our HTML and paste it right here. Now I have a couple other values here that I want to copy and paste. So I'm just going to paste these in here. And now we have the 3 variables which we're going to be using in order to define some colors in our project. Now the first thing we want to do is we want to go ahead and define the font family. So say body, font family, and it's going to be Fira Sans, and the fallback font is just going to be the default sans serif. So if you see that, you can already see our channel, or not our channel, but our page update with that new font. Let's go ahead and get an HTML and body here. We'll set the height to 100%. And let's go ahead now and style the main wrapper. So main wrapper. Display flex. Position relative. Justify content, and then center. Now here we're using Flexbox. Now Flexbox is kind of just one of the modern ways of handling layout in CSS. You'll often see Flexbox and CSS Grid used more commonly now instead of other alternatives that they used in the past. And essentially what this does is it creates like this area, and then you can define where things are actually laid out. So in this case, we created this Flexbox and then told it to justify the content. So everything in this wrapper is justified to the center. So now what we can do is just go ahead and move on and then say align items to the center as well. And what this is going to do is it's going to align everything to the size of the div, horizontally and vertically, because we defined justify content and align items. But the reason it's not doing that right now is because this, if we come in and look at it, this wrapper is not taking up the full height. So what we can do is say height, or actually let's do min height 100%. So now what it's doing is this main wrapper is looking at the body, which is 100%, and now it's filling up that entire spot. And if we close this console, you'll now see that it's centered vertically and horizontally. All right, so let's go ahead now and move on to adding some more styles here. So let's do a background. Let's do a background color, and we'll do variable. Let's do gray 900. So we save that. You can see it's a little hard to see everything, but you'll see that the background has changed. And the next thing we need to do is to create a gradient, a radial gradient. So again, I'll do background, radial gradient, and we'll say that this is an ellipse. Go ahead and. So that's the type of the size or the style that we want. At center, we don't need this comma. And then what we do now is we defined the starting point of the radius, and then the starting point color, and then the ending point color. So again, this is coming right from our design, and the starting color is going to be that variable called gray 700. And that's going to be at position 0%. And then we'll do a comma, the next variable, which is that gray 900. And that is at the end of our gradient, or in this case, 100%. So if we save that, you'll now see that we have this nice gradient on our page. So now everything in this wrapper is going to have that same color. So we'll just say color of variable gray 50. So you see now that these values are now changed to that gray 50 color. All right, so if we come into our index HTML, you'll see the next thing that I actually want to style is this content wrapper. So let's go ahead and create a new class here called Content Wrapper. This is going to use flexblocks as well. Now, by default, flex direction is set to row, which is going to align things left to right, but you can actually change that where they align themselves top to bottom by changing this to column. And then what we want to do is we want to align items to center and give this a little bit of a padding. So we'll say padding to rem. Okay, so now you can see everything is centered, and this little content wrapper is going to have a little bit of a padding to it as well. All right, so now let's go and style the next thing in this content wrapper, which is our title. So we'll set opacity, we'll just drop that down to 90%. We'll set a margin to this as well. So 0, 0, and then 2.5 rem. And this is a shorthand method of saying set 0 to the top, 0 to left and right, and then to the bottom set a value of 2.5 rem, which is about 40 pixels. Then we'll say color to a variable as well. And this is going to be, actually we actually don't need to set that because we defined it up here. To this main wrapper. Now you could define it down here and then get rid of this, and that would give you some more flexibility, but you can always override those styles here in the title if you wanted to change that. So let's go ahead and just keep that the way it is, and then we'll change this to font weight to the 800. So if we save that, you'll see that that is going to get updated, and then the margin is going to be added. So let's go change now the font size. Now in our design, it's 128 pixels. So this is about 8 rem. So you can see that by saving that, it gets a lot larger. We'll set line height to 1. And we also want to set align text to center, because right now, if we made this smaller, it's a little hard to see, but it's easier to see on this one. It will, the text won't be centered. So we need to make sure that it is text align center. And for some reason I murdered that. So it's text align. Okay. All right. So now that we have the title done, let's go ahead and move on to the next part, which is the subtitle. Again, we'll say opacity of 90%. Margin is similar, but a little smaller. So let's go ahead and set the font weight. So this is going to be 300. So it's going to be that light version. So if we save that, you can see that has changed. And then let's go ahead and set the font size. Set the line height as well. And set text align to center. All right, so let's go ahead and just shrink this one to show you that text align a little better. So if we got rid of this, you'll see that it's text aligned. It looks fine here because the page is big enough, but once we get to this point, it's not going to look right. So that's the reason we need that text align center. Okay, so let's make that the right size again. And then what we can do is we can go ahead and move on and title, we can style this channel. Remember that this is the span tag, so we can target that specifically by saying subtitle. And the direct children of this, we want to get the span element and style this with a text decoration line. So we'll say text decoration line, and it's going to be line through. So if we save that, you can see that we get this line through, which is the style that we want. And we can actually change the thickness of this with a CSS property called text decoration thickness. And we can do something like 2 pixels. And if we save that, you'll see now that it gets a little thinner. And I think that just looks a little nicer. All right, so now we can style the the link tag. So we'll say link. Inline flex, align items to center. And the reason we're doing that is because we want these items inside here, the SVG and the link, to be centered on each other. We'll set the opacity to this as well to 90%. Margin to 0. We'll say we need to define the color here. So we'll say variable gray 50. Okay. The font weight needs to be that medium size. So 500. Font size is 1 rem, 16 pixels. Font, or actually line height, is going to be 1.5 rem. Letter spacing is going to be 0.1 ems. And that again is coming from our design. We had a little bit of an increased line spacing here. And the next thing we need to do is we need to get rid of that text decoration. By default, links have that underline. So we'll say text decoration, and we'll set it to none. All right. Now, the next thing we want to do is let's go ahead and style this SVG. So we'll give it a margin left of 0.5 rem and a color of, actually it's picking it up from the link, so we don't need to set that. All right, so now what we want to do is once we hover over this, we want something to happen. And actually, it looks like we need to make sure that we're making this uppercase. So let's come back and do text transform uppercase. Okay. So now what we want to do is when we hover over this, I want to animate this SVG to kind of slide over to the right. So let's go ahead now and say link, then on hover, we'll target the SVG and we want the SVG to move over. So we'll say transform, translate, actually let's do translate X. And we want it to translate 0.5 rem, which is about 8 pixels. So if we save that, you'll see that now it works, but it's not really a smooth, nice transition. So what we can do in order to fix that is we can come up to this link SVG where we originally styled this and say transition. It's just going to be targeting transform. It's going to be 0.2 seconds. And it's going to be an ease in, ease out animation style. So now, once we hover over this, you see that it looks a lot nicer and we get that nice little CSS animation going on. All right, so now it's time to add the noise to this project. And I want to give credit where credit is due. And I actually was inspired by this page based off of this code pin here, where I was actually really surprised with how easy it was to actually get this effect going. So essentially what they're doing is that they're just using an image file from Dropbox. So if we go ahead and look at this, they're importing this image from Dropbox. So let's go ahead and just open this up. And what this is a noise, kind of like a noise pattern. And then all they're doing is that they're setting the size, it's tiled, so it's going to be this like seamless effect of noise. And then they're just animating it based off of random steps. So what they're doing is they're saying steps 8. And then so what this does is say, hey, pick some 8 steps between this and kind of just pick some values and then just do that over and over again. So it gives you this really cool effect that the images, or excuse me, the noise is moving around, but these images are just kind of moving and creating this really cool static effect. So let's come back into our CSS. And the first thing we want to do is target that noise wrapper. The position of this is going to be absolute. It's going to be set to top position and left position of 0. It's going to take up the full width, so 100%. Overflow will set to hidden. And the reason we need to do that is because things are moving around. We don't want any of those items to be shown once they move. And we also want to set pointer events to none. And the reason we're doing this is because this noise layer is sitting on top of our content. So if we didn't set that, we wouldn't be able to click on the link below this div because this one's covering it up. So that's the reason we need to tell this that there's no pointer events on this actual div. So we can save that. You'll see in our project that nothing's going to change because there's really no styles here, but we will, if we come into inspect, you'll see now that under this main wrapper, we have this new noise wrapper that is essentially covering the entire page on top, which is where we're going to be adding the noise. So the next thing we need to do is actually style our noise. So that's going to have a position here of absolute. We'll set, actually you'll say inset negative 500 pixels. And this is a shorthand method of writing. Instead of top 0, left 0, right 0, just it sets everything. So we'll do that. And then we'll say opacity to 0.35%. And that is because if we didn't set, or excuse me, not 0.35%, but 0.35, which is 35%. And the reason we're doing this is just so to kind of minimize on that effect, because if we didn't, it would just be super overdone. And the next thing we need to do is set the background. So let's go do background. So the color is transparent, but then we're going to set a URL here. So what you can do here in this project is I can import images directly from this. So right now we don't have an images folder, so I'll create one called images. And then from this, I can go ahead and save image as, come into my folder here where I have the project, and we'll call this noise and then click on save. So now you can see that that is in our project. So now we can import it. So we'll say source images noise PNG. All right, so once we save that, you can see that we're just getting this massive file. So what we can say is background size to 320 pixels by 320 pixels. All right, so now that we have that, the next thing we need to do is actually apply an animation to this. But before we apply the animation, we actually have to define the animation here using CSS Keyframes. So we'll say @keyframe, and then the name of the animation in this case is called noise. And essentially what we're doing here is we're defining different points of an animation based off of percentage. So at 0%, that's the starting point of the animation. And then we'll just define different levels throughout the animation. So instead of writing this all from scratch, because there's several different things here we need to write, I'm actually just going to copy this from the final project, paste it in. You can see here that there's there's like 10 steps here, right? So all they're doing is at each step, it's just moving the image to different spots. So now that we've defined the animation here in our keyframes, let's go ahead and use it here in the noise CSS class. And to do that, there's a shorthand property called animation, which is a way to define all the animation properties in one actual property. Now, if you want to see the full list of all these animation properties, be sure to check out the link in the description. I'll link to some documentation, as well as some extra videos and articles that explain some of the things that we're using here in more detail if you really want to dive in and understand how this is working. So the first thing we need to do is we need to define the name of the animation. So in this case, the name, which we define right here, is called noise. Then we say the duration, so in this case, 1 second. And we also want to define what should happen once this ends. So if we save this and refresh it, you'll see that it animates through all of these different keyframes and just stops, and then it reverts back to the original spot. So one way we can fix that is say infinite. And now if we do this, it will just kind of go on and on and on. But you can kind of see that there's this like very easy to see repetitive style here. You can see how it just you can kind of pick up on the pattern if you watch it long enough. And that's what the next couple of different values are going to help us kind of make it more random. And here you can define how many steps should be in the keyframe or in the animation. So even though we defined all these keyframes, this animation is going to essentially pick a couple different spots and have 8 distinct steps in the animation. So if we save that to 8, for example, you can kind of see that it's already a little like, it's still kind of a pattern here that you can see it, but it's not as as, you know, it's not as easy to identify because of these steps are a little bit more randomized. Now, I found that you could come in and change these a little bit and get different effects. If you drop this down to something like 2, it's even like a little more like jittery and slow, which might be a style that you're going for. So just play around with these to get a value that you like. And then I'm going to click save. Now, the last one is either forwards, backwards, or both, which is a animation fill mode. Now, typically you'll use forwards a lot, which means that the animation is going to start and then end and then stay there at the end where it finishes. Now, both means that it's going to have a starting position of not where the CSS class is, but wherever the starting position of the first keyframe is. So in this case, what we want to do is we want to apply both of those to this. Now, again, this both is kind of hard to wrap your head around if you're just kind of explaining it in a video without a lot of different examples. So check out the link in the description that has a really good walkthrough of how this fill mode actually works. All right, so if we save that, we can now see the final design here in our browser. If you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing. And be sure to hit the bell icon to be notified about future videos around this design and code series. Also, be sure to check out Skillthrive.com for developer lessons, as well as handy code snippets. Again, I'm Hunter from Skillthrive, and I'll see you in the next one.